Tala, leave the resident mail where it is and step back from the counter.
I help sort mail for families all the time.
Talia Burnsway operated inside a memory care wing for 4 years without anyone checking. 32 residents depended on her. 14 of them paid for that trust with their life savings.
Several financial statements came through this station before the accounts were drained.
That doesn't mean I touched anyone's money.
She would not be returning to her shift. Within 48 hours, sheriff's deputies would walk out of her house in Willowmere, Minnesota, carrying 3 checkbooks belonging to current and former residents of the memory care wing, where she had worked for a decade. 14 victims, $530,000. 4 years of theft calibrated to fall inside the ambiguous gap where dementia and forgery could be confused. The clinical progress notes that recorded her residence decline were about to become the single document that destroyed her defense. This one hit different when I started reading the file. Memory care exists for one reason: to protect people from exactly what's about to happen in this story. If you've ever had a parent or grandparent in long-term care, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit the button. We don't let cases like this disappear. Talia Marie Burnsway was born on September 14, 1975, at St. Joseph's Medical Center in Brainerd, Minnesota. Her father, Glenn Burnsway, worked second shift as a maintenance supervisor at the Potlatch Paper Mill on the Mississippi River. Her mother, Dolores, cooked lunches at Forest View Elementary School for 26 years. Talia was the third of 4 children and the only girl. The family lived in a 3-bedroom rambler on Maple Avenue, 2 blocks from the elementary school where her mother worked. She was a quiet child, average grades, loyal to a small circle of friends. Her mother's older sister, Marlene, lived in a nursing home in Little Falls beginning when Talia was 11, and the family drove down every other Sunday after church. Talia later told a high school counselor that she remembered the smell of that hallway better than any classroom she ever sat in. Disinfectant, mashed potatoes, lavender lotion. She remembered the way the aide spoke to her aunt, slowly and loudly, even after the strokes took most of Marlene's words. She remembered being the only person in the room who would still hold her aunt's hand. Marlene lived another 7 years and died when Talia was 18. By then, Talia had already filled out the application for the Central Lakes College Practical Nursing Program. She graduated from Brainerd High School in 1993, in the bottom half of her class. She worked as a server at the Country Kitchen on Highway 371 for 2 years, took the night shift, and saved enough to enroll at Central Lakes College in the licensed practical nursing program. She completed her LPN certification in August 1996. Her clinical instructor wrote in her final evaluation that she was patient, compassionate, and well-suited to long-term care environments, particularly with residents experiencing cognitive impairment. Her first nursing job was at Lakewood Health Center in Baxter, Minnesota, on the geriatric floor. Starting wage of $9.20 an hour. She worked there for 4 years. Co-workers remembered her as steady, dependable, and quietly funny on long shifts. In 1998, she married a man named Kyle Burnsway, a forklift operator at a distribution warehouse in Brainerd. Their son, Jaden, was born in March 2000. The marriage lasted 9 years. Kyle moved to North Dakota for an oil field job in 2007 and stopped sending child support within a year. After the divorce, Talia held a string of nursing positions across central Minnesota, a transitional care unit in Aitkin, a county-run nursing home in Crosby, a private memory care facility in Pequot Lakes. Each move came with a small raise. Each came with a longer commute. She drove a 2004 Subaru Outback with 240,000 miles on the odometer and a back seat that always smelled faintly of antiseptic hand foam. In February 2014, she applied for a licensed practical nurse position at Willowmere Assisted Living in Willowmere, Minnesota, a town of 5,200 people, about 40 miles south of Brainerd. The facility hired her at $19.40 an hour. Her primary assignment was the memory care wing on the second floor. Her annual evaluations through 2019 were uniformly positive. demonstrates exceptional patience with confused residents, maintains warm relationships with family members, reliable, punctual, well-suited to her assignment. She was promoted to shift lead in August 2017 and received a $2 an hour increase. By 2019, she was 44 years old, raising a teenage son largely on her own, paying down a second mortgage she had taken out to cover his orthodontia and a new transmission, and considered by her colleagues to be one of the most trusted nurses in the building. The facility administrator described her in a written commendation as the heart of memory care. Her son had just started his first year at North Hennepin Community College. Her mother had begun showing the early signs of the same disease Talia had spent 20 years treating in other families' parents. Dolores Burnsway, 68, had been forgetting the names of her grandchildren. She had left a pot on the stove and walked to a neighbor's house without remembering why. Talia drove up to Brainerd every other weekend to take her mother to medical appointments. The neurologist used the words, early onset. Talia did not tell her brothers. Willowmere Assisted Living occupies a 3-story brick building on Lakeshore Drive, set back from the road behind a stand of white pines. The first floor houses independent living apartments. The second floor is the memory care wing, 32 private rooms arranged in a long horseshoe around a central nursing station, with a secured door at each end and a coded keypad controlling the elevator. The third floor handles skilled nursing and end-of-life care. The memory care population at Willowmere is, by clinical definition, a group of people who have been losing pieces of themselves to disease for years. Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal degeneration. Their families place them at Willowmere because they can no longer be left alone, because they leave the stove on, because they wander, because they no longer recognize the bathroom in the home they have lived in for 50 years. That diagnosis is the foundation of the trust placed in the staff. A resident with moderate Alzheimer's cannot reliably tell a family member which nurse came into the room last night, cannot retain a memory of a phone call she signed her name during, cannot articulate in a way that her adult children will treat as fact rather than as a symptom that something is wrong. Every safeguard that normally protects a person's finances is degraded by the very condition that placed them in memory care to begin with. Recognizing an unfamiliar transaction, remembering a conversation, raising an alarm. There were 6 staff members on the memory care wing during day shift, 4 during evening, 3 overnight, 2 licensed practical nurses, the rest certified nursing assistants. Family members were not permitted in resident rooms unaccompanied during the pandemic visitation restrictions of 2020 and 2021. Even after restrictions lifted, the unit's daily rhythm meant that a resident's family was, on average, in physical proximity to that resident for fewer than 8 hours per calendar year. The staff was there every single day. The mail routing system at Willowmere added another layer. Many residents had set up their bank statements, Social Security notices, and brokerage correspondence to be delivered to the facility years before their cognitive decline accelerated, when independent management of the mail was still possible. By the time those residents moved into memory care, the mail kept arriving at the same address. The facility's mailroom, a small windowless room next to the staff break room, sorted the residents' mail into individual cubbies. Nurses on each wing routinely accepted and processed it. Out-of-state adult children, in many cases, never saw a paper statement at all. They monitored their parents' affairs through quarterly phone calls, holiday visits, and the occasional online login if they held power of attorney and had been given credentials. They trusted the system. They trusted the facility. They trusted above all the nurses who saw their parents every day. The first known transaction occurred on March 11, 2020, 8 days after Minnesota declared a peacetime public health emergency for COVID-19 and closed memory care visitation to family members. The resident was Eleanor Mosby, 84 years old, vascular dementia, no children, one nephew in Phoenix who held power of attorney. Eleanor's checkbook had been sitting in the top drawer of her bedside table since she moved into the facility in 2018. Her nephew had told the staff to lock it away. The the staff had forgotten. The first check was written for $230. It was made out to cash. The handwriting on the memo line read, groceries. Eleanor Mosby had not purchased groceries in 2 years. The check cleared her account on March 16th. No one noticed. No one checked. Over the following 4 months, Talia Burnsway wrote 11 more checks on Eleanor Mosby's account, each between $150 and $400, each made out to cash or to a payee with initials matching her own. The total drained from Eleanor's account in 2020 alone reached $4,300. By the summer of that year, the pattern had expanded. Talia had identified, by reviewing each resident's intake paperwork during routine chart reviews, the subset of her 32 residents whose financial mail came to the facility and whose adult children lived more than 500 miles away. She narrowed her targets to 14. She built profiles for each one: the bank, the routing number, the typical balance, the cognitive baseline, the frequency of family phone calls. For most residents, she calibrated the drains carefully. Monthly diversions of $200 to $1,200, always below the threshold that would trigger a fraud alert, always plausible in the abstract, as something an elderly person with declining judgment might do. A magazine subscription, a cleaning service, a charitable donation. She spread the activity across multiple residents so that no single account showed the steady downward arc that would have flagged it on a bank's algorithm. For the most cognitively impaired residents, she escalated. She wrote larger checks: $4,000, $6,200, $9,000 to a payee called TMB Holdings, a sole proprietor LLC she had registered with the Minnesota Secretary of State in November 2020, using her mother's address in Brainerd as the business of record. She also exploited what she called, in private notes investigators would later recover, the lucid windows. Most memory care residents experience brief periods of relative clarity, sometimes lasting an hour or two, often after a meal or in the morning before fatigue set in. During those windows, Talia would sit at a resident's bedside, place a check or a transfer authorization on a clipboard, and guide the resident's hand. The signature, in isolation, looked like the resident's own. The resident, 20 minutes later, had no memory of having signed anything. When families called the facility to ask about unfamiliar activity, the calls were often routed to the nurse on duty. Talia answered them herself. Her tone was patient. Her explanations were structured around the language families had been conditioned to accept. Your mother insisted on writing a check to the church last week, and we let her. It seems to comfort her to feel in control of something. Your father called the cable company himself and ordered a movie package. We don't restrict that kind of decision unless there's a safeguard in writing. Families thanked her. They apologized for bothering her. They told her she was wonderful with their parent. She kept a list of which families had called, what she had told them, and what she would need to say if they called again. The list was a single Word document on her home laptop, titled Schedule Notes. By the end of 2023, the total drained from 14 residents had reached approximately $530,000. She had paid off her second mortgage. She had bought a used Toyota 4Runner for her son. She had taken 2 trips to Sandals resorts in the Bahamas. She had invested roughly $200,000 in a brokerage account in her own name and the name of TMB Holdings. She continued to drive the 2004 Outback to work because, in her words to a coworker, "I don't want to look like I'm flashing anything." In late 2023, a fellow LPN named Marisol Reyes noticed something. A resident named Harold Pemberton, a retired Brainerd postmaster with frontotemporal dementia, had been agitated for 2 weeks about a lady taking my money. Marisol mentioned it to Talia at the start of a Tuesday shift. Talia listened, nodded, and explained that Harold had been fixated on financial themes since his admission. Marisol let it drop. 3 days later, she requested a transfer to the 3rd-floor skilled nursing unit. She did not put a reason on the form. Brenda Halpern lived in a craftsman bungalow in southeast Portland, Oregon, with her husband and 2 teenagers. Her mother, Margaret Halpern, 81 years old, mid-stage Alzheimer's, had been a resident of Willowmere's memory care wing since June 2021. Brenda held durable power of attorney. She called the facility every Sunday afternoon. She flew back to Minnesota twice a year. In late January 2024, Brenda sat down at her kitchen table with a glass of Pinot Grigio and her mother's bank statements to begin tax preparation. Margaret's accounts were straightforward: a small pension, monthly Social Security, a single certificate of deposit that rolled over annually. Brenda had been pulling and reviewing the statements quarterly for almost 3 years and had never flagged anything. That night, working backward from December and matching each transaction against the spreadsheet she kept, Brenda saw a pattern she had missed in her quarterly reviews. Small checks: $280, $410, $325. Always made out either to cash or to a payee with initials. Always cleared within 3 business days of being written, spread across 11 months. And then, in October, a single electronic transfer of $8,200 to a payee called TMB Holdings. Brenda called the bank the next morning. The bank told her the transfer had been authorized using her mother's online banking credentials. Brenda asked her mother, on a video call that afternoon, whether she had logged into her bank account recently. Margaret Halpern, who could no longer reliably name the current month, looked at the screen and smiled and said she was glad Brenda had called. Brenda filed a report with Minnesota Adult Protective Services on the morning of January 29, 2024. She filed a second report 2 hours later with the Crow Wing County Sheriff's Office Financial Crimes Unit. She did not call the facility. She did not call her mother's nurse. She wrote in the narrative section of the APS intake form, "I believe a staff member at Willowmere Assisted Living is stealing from my mother." Detective Sergeant Lana Ostrander of the Crow Wing County Financial Crimes Unit was assigned the case on the afternoon of January 30th. She had spent 12 years working elder financial exploitation cases in central Minnesota. She had learned, early in her career, that the difference between a single bad actor staff member and a facility-wide problem lived in the bank records of the other residents on the same unit. She drafted subpoenas for the bank records of all 32 residents currently housed in Willowmere's memory care wing, plus 7 former residents whose accounts remained active. She sent them on February 6th. The records arrived in rolling batches over the following 3 weeks. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. 14 accounts showed the signature characteristics of Margaret Halpern's. Small, irregular checks made out to cash or to initial-only payees. Occasional larger transfers to TMB Holdings. And timing that clustered around dates when the residents' clinical progress notes recorded confusion, agitation, or sundowning episodes that would not have been visible to outside family members. Ostrander pulled the Minnesota Secretary of State registration for TMB Holdings. The owner of record was Talia Marie Burnsway. The address listed was 1118 Maple Avenue, Brainerd, Minnesota, the home of Dolores Burnsway, Talia's mother. Ostrander obtained a search warrant for Talia's residence on March 14th. The search, executed at 6:15 on the morning of March 19th, recovered 3 checkbooks belonging to current and former Willowmere residents, a spiral notebook containing 28 pages of handwritten practice signatures, a printed list of 14 resident names with associated bank account numbers and approximate balances, and a laptop computer. The laptop contained the schedule notes document, a 4-year running log of family phone calls, the explanations Talia had given, and the variations she planned to use if pressed. It contained search history for Minnesota Statute of Limitations forgery, how banks detect check washing, and how to register an LLC without your home address. It contained screenshots of online banking sessions for 6 of the 14 victims, taken from the facility's wireless network during her overnight shifts. Investigators also recovered a manila folder kept in a locked box under Talia's bed. Inside were photocopies of 14 residents' driver's licenses, Social Security cards, and Medicare cards. Several of the documents had been altered. New addresses inked over the originals. The address she had used most often was the same one she had registered for TMB Holdings. The mailroom records at Willowmere, pulled by subpoena confirmed that Talia Burnsway had signed for and processed the financial mail of every one of the 14 affected residents on dozens of occasions across the 4-year window. Handwriting analysis on a sample of 41 questioned signatures, conducted by a forensic document examiner at the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension in St. Paul, returned the same conclusion in 39 of 41 cases. The signatures were inconsistent with the residents' authenticated exemplars. They were consistent in multiple structural features, with the practice signatures recovered from Talia Burnsway's notebook. We're heading into the part of this case that broke the defense. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel doesn't let these stories get buried. Subscribe before we go further. The single piece of evidence that ended this trial is one of the cleanest forensic exhibits I've ever read about. And then there was the medical record itself. Margaret Halpern, on the date of the $8,200 transfer to TMB Holdings, was documented by her own treating nurse practitioner, a colleague of Talia Burnsway's, as non-oriented to date, unable to identify the facility, unable to state her daughter's name without prompting. The clinical note had been written 4 hours before the transfer cleared. The progress notes for every one of the 14 victims told the same story on every one of the relevant transaction dates. The residents whose accounts had been drained were, by the documentation of their own treating clinicians, certifiably incapable on those dates of doing what Talia Burnsway's records claimed they had done. At 7:42 on the morning of April 4, 2024, Detective Sergeant Ostrander and 2 Crow Wing County deputies entered the second-floor memory care wing at Willowmere Assisted Living. Talia Burnsway was standing at the central nursing station, charting a medication pass. She was wearing teal scrubs and a beige cardigan. A navy ceramic coffee mug with a chickadee on it sat next to her keyboard. Ostrander identified herself. "Talia, we need you to step away from the desk. I'm in the middle of a med pass." "Another nurse can finish it. Step away from the desk, please." Talia set down her pen. Her hands went briefly to the keyboard, then to her sides. "Am I being arrested?" "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of vulnerable adult abuse, identity theft, forgery, and theft by swindle. We need you to come with us." She did not respond for several seconds. The deputy to Ostrander's left would later describe her expression in his incident report as flat, almost expectant. A resident in a wheelchair rolled slowly past the desk, looked up at the officers, and asked Talia if breakfast was ready. "I want a lawyer." She did not speak again. She was handcuffed at 7:46. She was walked out of the building through the staff entrance, past the mailroom, past the time clock she had punched 1,742 times over 10 years. The administrator stood in the lobby and did not look at her as she passed. A Crow Wing County grand jury returned a 32-count indictment on April 22, 2024. The charges included 1 count of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under Minnesota statutes, Section 600, 26.5572 for each of the 14 victims, identity theft under Section 6, 09.527, multiple counts of forgery under Section 6, 09.625, and theft by swindle under Section 6, 09.52 in an aggregated amount exceeding $35,000, the threshold for the most serious felony classification under that statute. Talia retained a Brainerd defense attorney named Reed Holloway, who had a long history of representing healthcare workers in licensing and criminal matters. Holloway's strategy, presented in pretrial motions and at the 8-day trial in November 2024, was the disease progression alibi. Residents with dementia, he argued, do make irregular financial decisions. They do lose checkbooks. They do authorize transactions they cannot retain memory of. The state's case, he told the jury in opening, was built on assuming the worst about a nurse who had given 10 years of her life to one of the hardest jobs in nursing. The prosecution's response was a single forensic exhibit. Assistant County Attorney Priya Naganathan presented to the jury a 14-page chart, 1 page per victim. Each page placed 2 columns side by side. On the left, the documented transaction. date, amount, signature, payee. On the right, the resident's clinical progress note from the same day, written by a treating clinician who was not Talia Burnsway. Cognitive orientation, mini mental score, capacity assessment. For every transaction across all 14 victims, the resident's own treating clinicians had documented, in real time, a cognitive status inconsistent with the financial sophistication the transaction required. Margaret Halpern could not state her daughter's name on the day she had supposedly authorized an $8,200 wire transfer. Eleanor Mosby, on the day she had supposedly written a check to a cleaning service, had been recorded as unable to identify the season. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 17 minutes on November 21st, 2024. They returned guilty verdicts on all 32 counts. Sentencing was held on January 16th, 2025. Brenda Halpern flew in from Portland and delivered the lead victim impact statement. She spoke for 11 minutes. She read aloud one of her mother's birthday cards from 2017, written before the disease had taken her mother's handwriting, in which Margaret had written, "I am so proud of the woman you became, sweetheart. Always know I trusted you to look out for me." Brenda paused after she finished reading the card. She said, "She trusted me to look out for her. I trusted that facility. That facility trusted Talia Burnsway. The only person who broke that chain is sitting at the defense table." A second statement was read into the record by Patrick Mosby, Eleanor Mosby's nephew in Phoenix. He had flown to Minnesota 3 times during the prosecution. He spoke for 6 minutes. Eleanor had died in October 2024, 4 weeks before the trial began. She had asked Patrick, on his last visit, whether her checkbook had been found yet. Patrick had told her it was being looked for. "My aunt died believing that her checkbook was misplaced," he said. "She did not die believing that the woman who brought her dinner every night had been stealing from her for 4 years. That is the one mercy I can give her, and I owe it to this court that the truth of that be on the record." Judge Marion Vance sentenced Talia Burnsway to 84 months in the custody of the Minnesota Department of Corrections, 7 years. Restitution of $530,042. Permanent revocation of her licensed practical nurse credential by the Minnesota Board of Nursing, and a permanent bar on employment involving custodial responsibility for vulnerable adults. The judge spoke from the bench for several minutes before pronouncing sentence. "You chose this population," she said, "because the disease they were dying of would help you hide what you were doing. You used the very documentation system that was supposed to protect them as the screen behind which you stole from them. That you did this for 4 years and only stopped because a daughter in Oregon happened to look closely at a single line item is not mitigation, it is aggravation. You did not stop on your own. You would not have stopped on your own." Talia Burnsway is currently incarcerated at the Minnesota Correctional Facility Shakopee, the state's primary women's prison, 60 miles south of Willowmere. Her projected release date is in 2031. Her son, now 25, has not visited. The Willowmere Assisted Living Memory Care Wing implemented new mail handling, financial oversight, and family communication protocols within 6 weeks of her arrest. The facility administrator was not replaced. 12 of the 14 affected residents are still alive. 2 died during the year the case was being prosecuted, without ever being told what had happened to their money. This case was quiet. The next one on the right-hand side is louder, and it ends worse.